All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I am really excited, actually. I'm going to be teaching an in-person class at a school close by. And I thought that this would actually be a really beneficial class. It's called The Changing World of Retirement Planning. But this is the last portion of the class. We kind of call it the final exam. And I felt that it was really valuable. I thought it would be extremely valuable for my clients and wanted to make sure that I gave everyone an opportunity to be able to see it. I believe it will be really useful for people that are wanting to retire now and also in the future. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to get into it. This is the final exam, essentially. Okay, I hope everyone can see. I'm going to get going. If you can't see, or well, if you can see, raise your hand and let me know. But I'm going to record this so you can share it. And I expect to be able to put it on YouTube so it can be seen. Okay, perfect. So glad. Okay, good. So let's get going. I'm excited about this. All right, so first question is going to start with a quiz. So what's the highest marginal tax bracket in the history of our country? What's the worst that it's ever been? Now, I know you can't talk, but I'm going to answer some of these questions for you. So the worst it's ever been was actually at the end of World War II, 1944, 1945, was 94%. Now that was the highest marginal tax bracket. That's for every dollar made above $200,000. Now that's a pretty big income at that time. It's about 3.5 million in today's dollars. I don't know if you can think of anyone back then who made that kind of money. There's not that many, maybe the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, but there was also an actor who later became a politician. You might recognize Ronald Reagan, right? So he actually, funny enough, if you looked into his autobiography, he said he only made 2 movies a year because each movie that he made, he got paid about $100,000. And once he made over $200,000, for every dollar he took home, he only kept 6 cents. So, and truth be told, he didn't even really get to keep those 6 cents because the rest of it really went to the state of California. So it didn't make any sense for him. It literally did not make any sense for him to make more than 2 movies. So after those 2 movies, he went back to his ranch, rode his horses, and, hung out until January 1st of the following year. But what was the marginal tax bracket, the highest marginal tax bracket in the entire decade of the 70s? This one is really, thankfully, easy for me to remember because it was 70%. Okay, now, again, for every dollar made over $200,000. Now, what is the highest marginal tax bracket today? Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you know this, but what is the tax rate that Bill Gates gets taxed on most of his money? 37%. Okay, now, what was it? What will happen to it after 2026? January 1st, 2026, it's actually going to go up to 39.6. Now it's going to go back up to 39.6. It was actually at 39.6 the entire decade of the 90s. Now, that's not necessarily enough to make me lose sleep at night, maybe not you either, but during the entire decade of the 90s, the market was actually doing pretty well. You could have put $100,000 into the market in 1990, took a nap for 9 years, woke up in 1999, and your money would have been about $600,000. So your money would have sextupled in that 9-year period. So I don't know about you, but with market conditions like that, I wouldn't be too worried about paying 39.6% in taxes either at that point. But here's the question. What is going to happen to tax rates beyond 2026? Okay, what do you think? Is it going to be lower or higher than 39.6? Now, if you think it's going to be higher, for those of you that say it's higher, why? What will the government be spending money on that we expect that will force taxes to go much higher? So let's get into that because there's several things. Let's start with debt. Okay. Now, how much money do we owe in the national debt? If you pay attention, right now we actually owe $35 trillion in debt. That's a 3 and a 5 followed by 12 zeros. Now, some of that money we borrowed from ourselves, some of that money we borrowed from Social Security, some of we owe to another country. I think you might know that one, China. Actually, I don't know if you heard, but the US Treasury just came out with a new $100 bill. I think it's actually because China has all of the old ones. Okay, I'm sorry, it's not going to get much better than that. But let's look at Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the CARES Act. I mean, the CARES Act alone, we borrowed almost $5 trillion to bail out the country during COVID. That's a significant amount that raised our national debt by a huge amount. Now let's look at pensions. The other day I was visiting with a client and I asked her, what happens to your pension if the company goes bankrupt? And she said, oh, well, I don't have to worry about that because the government says, federal government says that if my company goes bankrupt, they'll guarantee that I'll have at least 2/3 of my pension for the rest of my life. Now, I don't know if you know what that's called. That's an unfunded obligation. Okay. An unfunded obligation is a promise that the government has made that it can't afford to keep. So if you add up all of those unfunded obligations and other things like that, experts say it's actually not 35 trillion as our national debt, it's well over 200 trillion is our national debt. So let me ask you, let me go through a few more of these: defense, healthcare, welfare. If you had to pick two things on this list that will drive debt up more than any other, which two would you pick? Now, if you said Social Security and Medicare, you would be absolutely right. Okay, now I'm going to open up a brief parentheses on Social Security, so bear with me. Let's look at the history. So in what year was Social Security first established? 1935. It was the linchpin of the New Deal. It was the hallmark of the Roosevelt administration. So when Social Security first started, how many people, how many workers were putting into it for every one person taking out? I think a lot of you actually know this. It was 42-1. That's a massive number of people. How old did you have to be to draw on Social Security in 1935? 65 years old. Okay, it's a little bit different now. But what was the average life expectancy of people in 1935? 62. They didn't even expect that people were going to draw upon that money, right? And if you made it to 65 and drew upon Social Security before passing away, how long on average did people draw on it? 2 years. So they were set up, this was set up to last forever. Social Security was structured in a way that it was set up to last forever. But something happened at the end of World War II that really changed everything. The soldiers came back from war, they came home, they hadn't seen their wives, and boom. So let's look at the demographic trends in our country over the last century or so. So we have 5 basic generations. The first one is called the Henry Ford generation. Tom Brokaw called them the greatest generation. Second was the silent generation. These folks were still kind of reeling from the Great Depression. But then you have, what is this statistical anomaly right here? Yes, the baby boomer. So my mom is one of the first baby boomers, born in January. So baby boomers between 1946, we had 18 years of unprecedented procreation from 1946 to 1964. But here's the thing. Did they have kids of their own? Yeah, they had a few kids of their own. That's Generation X. Now, I am a Generation X. And then we have the last one, Generation Y. And oh my goodness, I have a friend and client who lives in Hawaii. He has 9 kids, and Y is exactly what he asks himself every night. But here's the thing. Look at the two here. Did the baby boomers have nearly as many children as their parents? No, absolutely not. They had 27 fewer children. So let's look how that will impact Social Security. Okay, today, how many workers contribute for every one person taking out? 3-1. That's a big difference from 42-1. What do we expect that to be in 10 years? 2-1. Ugh, okay. So what's the earliest age that you can draw upon Social Security today? 62. I think most of you know that, right? So how long would you continue to draw on Social Security most likely before you passed away? Now, here's the thing. I want to say this because life expectancy in this country is between 77 and 78 years old. But if you live to 62 and start drawing on Social Security, there's a high likelihood that you'll live another 23 years and be able to draw on it for all that time. So is Social Security set up and structured very differently than it was when it started in 1935? Yeah, absolutely. It was set up as kind of an insurance policy to keep us from, to help us if we're living too long. But now it's morphed into a type of pension that's just supposed to support us for almost a quarter of our lives. So I want to touch on a gentleman who used to work for the Government Accountability Office. His name is David Walker. I don't know if you've heard of him. It's the Comptroller General of the federal government. He was in office between 1998 and 2008, and he worked under Bush and Clinton, so both camps, right? He actually knows more about the fiscal condition of our country, including Social Security and Medicare, than pretty much anyone on the planet. And so when he came into office and started taking a look at the budget, he's, this guy's in the CPA Hall of Fame, right? He took one look at the books and said, we have promised way more than we can afford to deliver. It's like a fiscal cancer eating away at our country from the inside, right? He said, you think Social Security is bad? Medicare is 5 times more expensive, okay? He said, in order to be able to deliver on all of the promises that we've made, we have to double taxes immediately. Double taxes immediately. And if we don't double taxes immediately, it's okay, you don't have to, but for every year that we don't, the national debt will grow by $2 trillion until we reach this magic number of 53 trillion. Folks, what's wrong with a country that has $53 trillion in debt? Well, besides the fact that they're broke. When we reach that magic number of 53 trillion, the tax revenue, all of the tax revenue coming in, if everything stays the same, will only be enough to pay the interest on that debt. Not Social Security, not Medicare, not the principal, right? So actually, David Walker was so concerned about this that in 2008, he resigned and started crisscrossing the country, raising the warning cry about the fiscal condition of our country. He wrote a book that came out in 2010, and he actually went on a radio show. He went on NPR, and he started telling the radio hostess, we are going to have to double taxes or our country is going to go bankrupt. And she said, okay, I don't necessarily believe you. And he said, listen, he said, I can give you a 4-letter word that will explain to you why tax rates have to double. And she couldn't guess what it was. So they opened it up to the phone lines and they said, what do you guys think? And so people guessed jobs, debt, kids, wars, right? One guy called in and said health. We're like HEAL. No, that's not it. But if you've read The Power of Zero, then it's just math. It's a simple mathematical, simple mathematical equation. So, okay, we're gonna go through the math part. Here's the deal. I wanted to go a little lighter for a second because I think it's a little bit depressing to talk about how dire our country's situation is financially. But I know a lot of you recognize this character, the Roadrunner. I think most of you probably have watched his cartoons at some point. Okay, but who is his nemesis? Wile E. Coyote, right? And what was Wile E. Coyote always trying to do? He was always trying to end the Roadrunner, pretty much trying to kill him. So this one particular episode, Wile E. Coyote is working on a bomb, and he's completely fixated on building this bomb made by Acme, right? In a little shed also made by Acme. And he's so intent on building this bomb, but he doesn't realize that the Roadrunner has pushed his shed onto the train tracks. Now, you guys have probably seen this one, right? So he doesn't realize until the last possible second that there's a huge freight train bearing down on him. Now, this is, I guess, one of the most important questions I'll ask you today, but if you found yourself on a train track with a huge freight train bearing down on you, what would you do? You probably would just go and get off the track, right? Well, instead of jumping out of the way, Wile E. Coyote simply just pulls down the window shade, like thinking that the act of pulling down the window shade would make the problem go away. Now, there's a huge explosion. Obviously, the problem doesn't go away. There's smoke and fire, right? It's really frustrating because the coyote never dies, right? But so why are we talking about in a retirement class about the coyote? Why? Very simple. Because most Americans that are saving in 401ks and IRAs and tax-deferred vehicles have a very real freight train coming down on them in regards to taxes. And so we have a couple of choices of what we can do about it. We can pretend the problem doesn't really exist. We can pretend that the math to which David Walker refers doesn't really add up. But isn't that a little like kind of just pulling down the window shade and hoping that the problem will go away? or we can start to implement some strategies this year that will help insulate us and buffer us from the impact of higher taxes. Okay. Some of these strategies we're going to talk about today that can help you get off the railroad tracks. Okay. So now for starters, no matter where you invest your money, there's many, many different ways that you can do it. And I'm going to talk about the different buckets. And I know a lot of you have probably heard this, but the first bucket is the taxable bucket. Okay. Every year as your money grows, you pay a little bit in tax. Okay. So examples of this would be savings accounts, CDs, money markets, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, what have you, right? How can you tell if your money is in this bucket? It's called a 1099, right? So, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, your money grew this much. And now we want a little, you're gonna have to give a little bit back to us in the form of taxes. Okay, so the 1099 is really the tip off. So generally speaking, the growth on this money is 100% taxable. Why do we leave it there if it's 100% taxable? Because it's very liquid, because it's an emergency fund, right? And how much money should we have in our basic emergency fund in this bucket? About 6 months worth of reserves, right? Of expenses. Now, can you have too much in this bucket? Yeah, absolutely. You can have too much in this bucket. Funny enough, I see it all the time. People will shuffle into my office and they'll say, oh, we have this many CDs and we feel like, oh, we've got 6, 7, 8 CDs and we feel like we're paying too much in taxes. Are they paying too much in taxes? Yeah, absolutely. Because here's the thing, you can have too much money in this bucket from a tax efficiency standpoint, but you can have too little in this bucket from an emergency fund standpoint. So what's the right amount of money in this bucket? 6 months of basic living expenses. Okay, so next bucket. Okay, second bucket. That's what we refer to as the tax deferred bucket. You don't pay taxes as you go, right? I'm sure you can think of some examples of these accounts. These are pretty common for people. 401ks, 403bs, annuities, you get the idea. Okay. Now there are slightly different rules that apply to all of these. There we go. Slightly different rules that apply to all these, but they have a couple of things in common. One is that generally speaking, when you put money into these accounts, you get a tax deduction, right? If you make $100,000, you put $10,000 into one of these accounts and the IRS treats you like you made 90. The second thing they have in common is the manner in which they come out for distribution. So how does the IRS characterize these distributions? They call them something really specific, ordinary income, okay? Does it sound familiar? Because what it means is that when you put the money into your 401k, all you really did was defer the receipt of that income until some point later down the road when you take the money out. And what tax rate are you taking that money out? Who knows? We don't know what tax rate. It just depends on the tax rate, that whatever the tax rate is the year that you take that money out, right? Folks, isn't that a little bit like going into business with the IRS? And every year they get to decide what percentage of the partnership and the profits they want? Kind of a little bit scary. Think about it this way. Doesn't sound like a good partnership to anyone, I'm sure, but think about it this way. If you had $1 million in your IRA, but you couldn't accurately predict what the taxes would be when the money comes out of your account, when it comes out of your IRA, do you really know how much money you have in that account, right? And it's really difficult to plan for retirement if you don't know how much money you actually have. Everybody in a good mood now? Yeah, okay. But there is a third bucket, okay? So let's talk about it. So now there's all sorts of names for this bucket: tax preferred, tax advantage, some call it tax exempt. I like to call it tax free. Now I have to warn you, there are all sorts of different investments that kind of masquerade as tax free, but in order to be truly tax free, it has to qualify in a couple of different ways, okay? First, when I say tax free, I'm talking about free from federal tax, state tax, and capital gains tax, okay? Now, how many of you have heard of municipal bonds? Okay, are they free from federal tax? Yes, they're free from federal tax. Okay, are they free from state tax? Not necessarily. Now, I live in California. If I buy a municipal bond in Arizona, is California going to give me a break on the gains? No, They're not. Why? Because it doesn't benefit the municipality in which I live, right? Now, what if I decide that I don't want to put all of my eggs in one basket and I get a mutual fund of municipal bonds and they appreciate in value and I sell it at a gain? Will I pay capital gains tax? Yes, I will pay capital gains tax. Okay. The second thing I'm looking for in a truly tax-free investment is no Social Security taxation. In other words, when you take the money out, it should not count as provisional income. Now, provisional income is the way that the IRS decides if they're going to tax your Social Security. Now, if you're already collecting Social Security, you might be familiar with this, but provisional income includes 1099s from your taxable bucket. It includes distributions from your tax deferred bucket, and then 1/2 of your Social Security. Now, here's the thing. In this case, municipal bonds do count. They do count towards provisional income. So an investment that we've been told is tax-free is not really truly 100% income tax-free. So what we're going to do with the remainder of our time is we're going to go over a case study. And I want to make sure that you kind of understand that this case study is not necessarily going to apply specifically it's not going to fit anyone on this Zoom or anyone who's watching this completely perfectly. But I can guarantee that there is going to be something in this example that will apply specifically to you. So I want you to watch out for it. Okay. The example I'm going to give you is Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who are clearly blissfully happy. They are 50 years old. They make $100,000 annually, and they want to retire at 65. So let's look at their case. Okay. Now, remember our buckets. We have our taxable, we have our tax deferred, and we have our tax free. Okay. So let's say between the two of them, they have $500,000 in their IRAs. Okay. They've got $10,000 in mutual funds. They've got a 401k with no match. They're putting 10% in, right? And then they've got term life, our last one. Term life, they're paying $2,000 a year for, and then long-term care that they're paying $4,000 a year for. Now, if this client walked into a typical like tax deferred paradigm financial advisor's office, how would the conversation go? It might go something like this. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, congratulations. They always congratulate you. You've done a great job saving in your IRAs. You know, the problem is last year you made 7%. We think that we could get you 8%. So we think you should roll that on over to us. Okay. Now, as far as your mutual funds go, that's a great emergency fund. Problem is last year you only got 3%. We think we can get you 5%. So let us manage that for you. Okay. As far as your 401k with no match goes, well, keep on doing it. You know, when you're ready to retire, you know, let us roll that over. We'll put it all under one roof, save you some break points, save you some fees, and we'll help manage that for you. So just keep on doing it. And then as far as the term insurance and the long-term care, it's not really something that we do, but who are we to tell you to stop doing it? Okay. Now here's the thing. When I look at this, when I visit with someone and this is their case, when someone walks into my office, I see red flag, red flag, red flag, red flag. Okay. Here's the deal. I'm not as concerned with what's in that IRA today. What I'm concerned with, what keeps me awake at night, is what it's going to look like in 15 years when they're ready to retire. So 15 years, it grows at 8%. They're going to have close to 1.6 million. Now, what's wrong with having 1.6 million in your tax deferred bucket? It hasn't been taxed yet. In fact, the required minimum distributions, did you know that the required minimum distributions on 1.6 million would put you actually in one of the highest marginal tax brackets already? Pretty much guarantees that your Social Security will be taxed into perpetuity. And I'll tell you guys, this is when the IRS has you exactly where they want you, because there's nothing you can do about it. So what do we want to do? We want to prevent this IRA from ever getting to 1.6 million, because we want to get into the 0% tax bracket. So how do you prevent an IRA from growing? And don't anybody say, put it in the stock market. Okay. So, well, one thing you can do is shift it to the tax-free bucket, right? So this is when someone will say, hey, how about we do a Roth conversion? Now, a Roth conversion says that you can shift money from, shift money from the tax deferred to the tax-free bucket, right? Pay tax at the current rates, right? Now, let's for these guys, right? Assuming 40%, we're trying to go with round numbers here. So let's assume that they're going to move the full 500,000 in 1 year, and they're going to pay about 40% in taxes. That's about $200,000. Now, do Mr. and Mrs. Jones have 200,000 just laying around that they would love to earmark for this tax bill? I don't think so. Okay. Some people will say, oh, we'll just withhold the taxes and it'll be fine. So then 300,000 will go into the account. They can pay the taxes, the 200,000, no problem. But remember, they're not 59 and a half yet. So they would also get a 10% penalty. So I actually would not recommend a Roth conversion in this case. I would, however, recommend a little known section of the IRS code called 72 subsection T. Now in our industry, we call it a 72T. Okay, why do I like this? Because it allows you to take equal annual distributions from your IRAs pre-59 and a half. Now you do pay the tax on what you put into the 72T, but you don't pay the penalty. Okay. Now distributions, they have to continue for 5 years or until 59 and a half, whichever is longer. These days, a 50-year-old can do about 5% per year. Okay. So let's look at this. So what's 5% of $500,000? 25,000. And we can shift that into the tax-free bucket. By the way, we can actually pay the taxes right out of on that 72T, right out of that 25,000. Stuck. There we go. Okay. Now let's take a look at their mutual funds. Their mutual funds. So we want to actually shift. They're growing their emergency fund. They've got an emergency fund of 100,000, which probably should be closer to 50,000 because you only need 6 months. So they're making the problem worse because not only are they growing it in mutual funds, but they're continuing to gain on taxes every year. So we're going to shift a little bit of the principal and a little bit of the gains over into the tax-free bucket, about $6,000 a year, which is what we've allocated. So the next, now how do we feel about 401ks with no match? Okay, now here's the thing. This is where Susie Orman and Dave Ramsey and Clark Howard pretty much all agree that when the rule of thumb when it comes to 401k is you put in just enough to get the match, but not a single penny above and beyond that. So do whatever is required to get the free money, then move on to the next best thing. Now, if these folks are trying to prevent their IRA from growing and now putting money into a 72T and also contributing to a 401k that's going to be taxed later down the road, this is a kind of a conflicting strategy. So we're going to have them stop doing that contribution and free up that 10,000. Now, let's also look, how do we feel about the term insurance and the long-term care insurance? Well, we think it's incredibly important because either one of these, in any issue in either one of these could really toss your financial apple cart and cause a big problem. Now, sometimes, not always, there can be a better way to accomplish this. So we're going to free this up for the time being. Okay, so how much money total were we able to free up on an annual basis? $47,000. Now at this point, I know some of you out there are like, well, you didn't actually free up 47,000. Why not? And they'll say, because there's taxable events, right? So we did create some taxable events. The 72T is a taxable event. The 401k with no match is a taxable event. So let's look at that. So we had additional taxable income of 35,000. So I know there's a lot of numbers, but 30% of that 35,000 is about 10,500. Now, do they really want to pay 10,500 for this tax bill? Probably not. Like if I tell them, hey, you just need to tighten the belt a little bit and, stop going on vacation, are they going to return my calls? Yeah, probably not. So we have to find them a way to be able to pay for this tax bill without encroaching on their lifestyle. So let's just pay it directly out of the 47,000 that we freed up. Okay. Now this is where the rubber meets the road. So where do we put 36,500 where it can grow in a truly tax-free way? Now is when we'll look at funding my favorite tax-free investment. Mr. and Mrs. Jones are looking at putting into a Roth IRA. So how much can two 50-year-olds put into a Roth IRA? These days, it's $8,000 a year. So that's $16,000 a year between the two of them. Why do we like Roth IRAs so much? Because all distributions after 59.5 are 100% tax-free. And here's the big one. The distributions do not cause Social Security taxation. Okay, big one. Roth IRAs are truly tax-free. So we have 36,500 and we contributed 16,000 into Roth IRAs, and now we have 20,500 left. Now, where can we put that 20,500 where it can grow in a truly tax-free way? Let's look at it. Well, at this point, we may recommend a bucket of money that gets treated differently for tax purposes than anything else that we've talked about thus far. What happens is that when you put money into this bucket and it begins to fill, the IRS says that the money in this bucket gets treated differently. Now, what am I talking about? The IRS says you can touch this money pre-59.5. You can access it without penalties. You can't do that in your 401k or your IRA. Okay, further, as your money grows, there are no 1099s. What does that mean? No tax as your money grows. Then they're going to tell you that if you take it out right away, that it's not reportable income. So tax-free distributions. I love that. And it doesn't count as provisional income. Now, no contribution limits. What did we say the contribution limits were on a Roth IRA for two 50-year-olds? $16,000, $8,000 each. Clients, I have clients who put $50 a month into these plans, and I have clients that put $200,000 a year in these plans, and everything in between. Okay. Next, there's no income limitations. You know, I mentioned Bill Gates way at the beginning, but can Bill Gates do a Roth IRA? No, he can't. Why? Because he makes too much money. He makes more than $240,000 a year. Can my girls do a Roth IRA? No, they can't. Why not? Because they don't have income. Let's say you're retired, you're living on a pension, drawing money on Social Security and taking distributions from an IRA. Can you do a Roth IRA? No, you have to be working somewhere and earning a paycheck. Okay, I know those rules apply to this particular bucket. Now, the last one is probably my favorite because if history serves as a model, there's no legislative risk. Now, I'm going to ask you guys, and of course you can't answer me, but have you ever heard of this type of clause? You know, my mom worked at Kaiser for 10 years and she had a pension. And 10 years after working there, they changed the pension. And they said everyone who comes into the pension after that point that we changed it has the new rules. But everyone who started it before that change follows the old rules. What do we call that? It's called a grandfather clause. So they've changed the rules on this bucket 3 times, in 1982, in 1984, and 1988. And every time they changed the rules, they simply said, whoever has this bucket before the rule changes gets to keep it and continue putting money in it under the old rule the rest of their lives. We call it a grandfather clause. Okay. Now, usually at this point, someone says, oh my gosh, this is the perfect investment. It's the alignment of the stars. I want to put all my money here. But is it really ever a good idea to put all of your eggs in one basket? No. Here's the thing. The IRS says that if we're going to give you this unlimited bucket of tax-free dollars, we're going to require that there's a cost of admission. Okay, that little spigot attached on the side through which flows on a monthly basis some expenses. And what do those expenses go towards? They actually go towards administrative costs and term insurance. Okay, they go towards the cost of term life insurance. Now, let me ask you an important question. If your house is paid off and your kids have moved out and you're rapidly approaching retirement, is term life insurance really on your Amazon wish list? No, really, that's actually the time that people start dumping their insurance. And the companies that sponsor this, they know that. And so they've done something to kind of sweeten the pot. What they do is they simply say, in the event that somewhere down the road you should need long-term care, they will give you your death benefit while you're alive for the purpose of paying for it. So let's say you have a death benefit of $400,000. You wake up one day and you can no longer feed or bathe yourself, transfer yourself, what have you, any of the 2 out of 6 activities of daily living, and you can find one doctor to write a letter to that effect. The insurance company will start sending you 25% of that death benefit, or $100,000 every year for 4 years for the purpose of paying for long-term care. Now, companies may discount that amount based on your age, but the point is they're willing to give you the death benefit while you're still alive in advance of your death for the purposes of paying for long-term care. Okay. Now, have any of you ever looked into traditional long-term care insurance? It's pretty expensive. And sometimes it can be really hard to qualify. You have a bad back or a bad knee, and you're out. And what happens if you pay for years and years and years, 20 years, and then you pass away peacefully in your sleep? Do they send all your money back? No, they don't. And that can be a source of heartburn for a lot of people, because nobody wants to pay for something, cross your fingers, and they hope they never have to use, right? This is different, because if you pay for it all this time and you pass away peacefully in your sleep, you know that someone is still getting a death benefit. So there's this sensation of paying for something that you'll never use. And by the way, have Mr. and Mrs. Jones already bought into the idea of term insurance and long-term care insurance? Yeah, they've already budgeted for it to the tune of $6,000 a year. So what we're suggesting is, instead of sending that money off to an insurance company in just the form of a premium payment, why not dump it into their bucket and let a portion of it drip out in the form of expenses, and now take advantage of that huge bucket of tax-free dollars that wasn't previously available to them. Okay, so what do we call this magical bucket? We call it a LIRP, Life Insurance Retirement Plan. Apparently my computer is a little bit slow today. Okay, so that stands for Life Insurance Retirement Plan. Why life insurance? Because the IRS says that in order for this bucket to work, you have to be willing to pay for the cost of term insurance. Why retirement plan? Because one of the primary purposes of building this money up is so that somewhere down the road, you can use it to pay for your lifestyle at a period when taxes are likely to be much higher than they are today. Okay, so what is the perfect tax bracket? Now, I know I already said it, so I think that you guys you already know it's 0, right? But I've got a pretty important question to ask, because I want to find out how we're doing so far. Okay, so let's look at it. How did we do with Mr. and Mrs. Jones? Okay, so we $16,000 going into their Roth IRA every year. Oops. So as long as they're 59 and a half, when they take that money out, will they pay tax? No, no tax. We've got quite a bit of money going into the LIRP every single year, regardless of how old they are. When they take that money out, will they be taxed? No, no tax. But let's go back to the IRA. So remember that $500,000 IRA? The goal in doing the 72T was to prevent it from growing. So if we did a good job of preventing it from growing, how much money would still be in there by the time these folks reach 65? Hopefully $500,000, right? So is there any way to get that $500,000 IRA money out of there without paying tax? And it has to be legal. Yes, we could do this, right? We can do standard deductions. Okay, so the IRS gives you've lost all your deduction, kids, mostly interest on your mortgage, contributions to your retirement accounts when you were working, maybe charity, right? But if you lose all of those, you still have your standard deduction. So the standard deduction this year is $29,200 for a married couple. Now, the IRS indexes this with inflation, so it's about 3%. So we figure by the time it's time for them to retire at 65, their standard deduction will be closer to $44,450. Okay, so let's look at this. Here's their bucket. So they have $44,450 of standard deductions. How much can they take out of their IRA without having to pay taxes? $44,450. Now, if we had let that IRA grow to 1.6 million, would required minimum distributions alone be greater than the $44,450? Yeah, absolutely. So here's where we where the rubber meets the road. So we have the Roth IRA. We should have no tax here, right? Distributions out of the Roth IRA should have no tax. We should have the distributions out of the LIRP, no tax. We've got the standard deduction on their IRA coming out with no tax. And if we can stay below the threshold of provisional income, we should have no tax, no tax, no tax, and we should have no tax on our Social Security. We're in the 0% tax bracket. What a big deal, okay? Now, why do we make such a big deal about the 0% tax bracket? Because what's the next tax bracket? Don't anybody say 1, okay? It's 10. Oh, it's 10. So, and so we'll throw in another 6 for state. Now, a lot of us live in California where it's higher than that, but just bear with me. We teach this class all over the country, so 6%. But now, and if what David Walker says comes true and tax rates have to double to keep our country solvent, that's 32%. And all of a sudden, second place isn't looking so good. So I really appreciate things making sense conceptually, but I also really want them to make sense mathematically. So let's look at a before and after comparison, kind of like the diet photos, you know, I'll suck in my gut. Okay, so if Mr. and Mrs. Jones, so we do this before and after. And so if Mr. and Mrs. Jones had never met me and they kept doing exactly what they were doing and over the course of their lives, and somehow taxes stayed at 30%, they would have about 4.4 million. Here we go, 4.4 million. Although they would run out of money at 85. Okay, at which point they can either die or move in with their kids. And most people would rather, well, you got it. Conversely, if Mr. and Mrs. Jones do exactly what we prescribed here, and they spend about 7.9 million. And not only that, but they have 1.4 million left over at age 100. And here's the kicker though. Most importantly, what happens to this column over here if tax rates double? It gets smaller. What happens to tax rates in this column if tax rates double? Absolutely nothing. Okay, absolutely nothing. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is if you get into the 0% tax bracket and tax rates double, what's 2 times 0? Still 0. Okay, so the only way to truly insulate yourself from the higher impact of taxes is to get into the 0% tax bracket. Okay, so now usually I get asked 3 different questions. Okay, the first one is usually, am I too old for this? Am I too old to get into the 0% tax bracket? And I usually respond to this question this way. I'm going to show you a little video that was done by David McKnight, who's one of my mentors. He actually kind of went all over the country interviewing the foremost experts on the national debt. And I want you to hear what they had to say. So let me go into this. I hope you guys can hear.
The truth is the federal government has lost control of the budget.
Instead of paying for all the new initiatives, whether they're tax cuts, spending increases, all sorts of things that we like, the government's just putting it all on the national credit card. And as a result, our national debt is just going up and up and up. And it's growing faster than the economy. And that's when you know you have a real problem.
Everything is going to be squeezed out of the budget. There won't be anything left.
The road we are on is a perilous one that ultimately leads to the bankrupting of our country.
So we have a crisis on our hands.
All Congress has to do for this whole situation to come to a head, because every year that they do nothing makes the problem even more unsolvable.
We don't seem to have the ability to get along and find common ground.
Is the government trying to trick you right now? Then the answer is very simply yes.
So why is this being swept under the rug? Why is nobody talking about it? Probably because it's not popular. So I've actually been traveling around the country for about 4 years now, taking the Power of Zero message to different groups.
When you cut taxes on current generations, you are simultaneously raising them on future generations. It is all driven by spending. Once we have spent $1,
we've already decided to tax. The only question is whether we tax it now or we borrow it now and tax it in the future.
So to make up for the liabilities that we're incurring with all the promises we've made in social insurance programs, we're gonna have to increase substantially the tax rate and perhaps even double it.
Now, precisely how high it's gonna be, you know, there's a lot of room to debate. People will have to pay more tax.
People's retirement savings are at risk of future higher taxes.
Well, qualified plans really do two things. They defer the tax and the tax calculation. Now let that road past your brain real slow.
I'm driven by trying to help as many people as I can avoid this disaster that's gonna come up in retirement.
Uh-oh. So that was it. That was the end of that video. I think I touched the mouse. So here's the thing. These foremost experts on national debt are talking about, they're all singing the same song. They're listening to the same music, singing the same song. And so the question isn't necessarily, am I too old to get into the 0% tax bracket? It's more, in 10 years, am I going to look back by the time tax rates double and think, why didn't I take advantage of historically low tax rates at a time when I could? Okay, so this is an important point to make. Next question I usually get is, can you be in the 0% tax bracket and be a good citizen? Now, I think this is important because we're not really suggesting that Mr. and Mrs. Jones not pay tax, right? They have to be willing to pay the tax in order to be able to get to the 0% tax bracket. We're just simply suggesting that when given the choice between paying the taxes at lower rates in today's times versus pushing that down the road, that they're probably going to be in a better situation to pay them off today versus paying them later. And I want to read a quote by Learned Hand, who is a Court of Appeals judge, never became a Supreme Court justice. He says, anyone may arrange his affairs so that his taxes shall be as low as possible. He is not bound to choose that pattern which best pays the treasury. There is not even a patriotic duty to increase one's taxes. Over and over, the courts have said that there is nothing sinister in so arranging affairs as to keep taxes as low as possible. Everyone does it, rich and poor alike, and all do right, for nobody owes any public duty to pay more than the law demands. So yes, you can be a good citizen and be in the 0% tax bracket. And the last question that I usually get is, how come I've never heard of this before? Now, I would venture to say that most of you have actually heard of most of these things already, maybe short of the LERP, right? Maybe you hadn't heard of the LERP before, but we're doing something a little bit different than what people expect with the LERP. That might seem unfamiliar to you, but normally when you hear about insurance, you talk about getting the most amount of coverage as you possibly can for the smallest amount of money. Now that's term insurance. What we're talking about is utilizing the smallest amount of coverage that you possibly can while taking advantage of the tax advantage or tax-free bucket of money that can grow inside. So we're trying to really stuff as much money into that tax-free bucket as much as the IRS will allow without the limitations of the Roth IRA. Okay. The other reason why you might not have heard of this is because most money management institutions don't even really want to bring it up. And I'll give you an example. So if you have $1 million under management, they charge you a fee, a 1% fee, which is about $10,000 per year in this case. Now, if they were to persuade you that tax rates are going to be higher in the future than they are today, you might actually feel compelled to shift that money into the tax-free bucket and pay the 30% in taxes. So now you have $700,000 in your tax-free bucket. And if they're still charging you 1%, they're now making only $7,000. Okay. Now, didn't they just experience a pay cut for persuading you the tax rates you're in the future are going to be higher than they were? So higher than they are today. So, and for that reason, most money management institutions don't want to touch this conversation with a 10-foot pole. Okay. I honestly don't care how much money you have. The only thing that matters to me is how much you actually get to spend after tax. It's the only number that truly matters. Whew, okay. So for those of you that are taking notes, here are 5 takeaways. Okay. The first takeaway is that tax rates are likely to be much higher in the future than they are today. Okay, mathematically speaking, there's simply no way around it. I wish that there was, but there isn't. Okay, takeaway number 2. The only way to truly insulate yourself from the impact of taxes is to get into the 0% tax bracket. Okay, why? Because with tax rates double, 2 times 0, still 0. Okay, takeaway number 3. I've been doing this for almost 18 years now, and I've helped put hundreds of people on the road towards 0% tax bracket. And I've noticed something pretty interesting. It's almost impossible to get into the 0% tax bracket by relying on only one income stream. You can't do it by just using a traditional Roth IRA. You can't do it by only using a LERP. You know, it's usually about 5 to 6 different income streams, but all of which show up under the IRS's radar. And that's how you can be in the 0% tax bracket. Takeaway number 4. You know, it used to be that we used to say, oh, somewhere in the future, like way down the road, taxes are going to go up. When's it going to happen? You have to be prepared for it. But now we know January 1st of 2026, taxes are going up. Nothing changes. Okay. And every year between now and then represents a window of opportunity to take advantage of historically low tax rates. And every year that we let go by without taking advantage is potentially a year beyond 2026 where we could be forced to pay higher tax rates than we'd like. And then takeaway number 5, all of this is actually good news. You know, I sit with and visit with people all the time. And I had one lady say to me like, wow, this is really depressing because now I have all of my money in the tax deferred bucket. What am I going to do? And I said, well, you know, you have to remember, you were able to put that money in and get a tax deduction for it when tax rates were higher than they were today. And now you were able to grow that money tax deferred. You didn't have to pay taxes along the way. And now we have a window of opportunity where you can get those dollars into tax-free investments. So by the time that tax rates double, you've done the heavy lifting so you can enjoy more of the money that you have without having to worry about astronomical taxes. And so that's when she was like, oh, okay, I get it. But so it is good news. At least you know you have the ability to do it. So here's the message, you know, as long as you take advantage of the next couple of years with historically low tax rates, then you get to determine how much of your retirement savings, that hard-earned retirement savings, that you get to keep. So last slide. For all of my clients and you know, anyone who's seeing this class, I would definitely recommend sitting down for a complimentary strategy session. And I'm sure I've met with many of you, but there are a few different projections that we'd like to do. And this is kind of newer. The first projection we like to do is if you never met me, you never changed anything that you were doing, and tax rates magically were able to stay at 30%, how long would your money last? That would be one. Second projection would be if you kept doing everything that you're doing and tax rates actually went to 50%, how long would your money last in that scenario? And then we'll run a third projection. This is if you implement all the recommendations that we suggest and we can get you to the 0% tax bracket right by retirement, how much longer could your money last? And if it turns out that being in the 0% tax bracket can put an extra 7 to 10 years on retirement, or an extra $500,000 to $1 million in income in your pocket for retirement, and it's probably something worth looking into. So I appreciate all of you for jumping on this evening. And if you haven't sat down with us for a consultation or you haven't scheduled that time, please get with me, get with my assistant, and we'll be happy to go through all of these computations for you and give you a projection. So let's get our schedules coordinated. So I appreciate you. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.